Okay, so the last thing I want to say about saying something about is this concept of the principle of charity. And this is going to be important because a lot of times when we put an argument into standard form or distill it, sorry, the jargon some people use is standard form, but distill an argument, we're going to paraphrase it, right? We're not just going to literally say everything it says. We're going to rephrase it a little bit. And especially when we rephrase people's arguments, we have to be fair to them. We have to make sure we are thinking about the argument they're actually making and not just attributing some crazy claim to them. There's even a word for this fallacy of like you give somebody a stupid argument, then you show the argument that you give them, which is stupid. That's called straw manning an argument. And it's generally a very bad thing to do. A, because you're not being fair to the person. B, because, well, if you show that this stupid argument that they're not even making is stupid, you haven't shown anything about their actual argument. And the principle of charity says don't do that. It actually says do the opposite of that. Give the other person the argument you're interpreting, give them the best case possible. What that means is if the conclusion is vague, give them the most plausible conclusion possible. By plausible, I mean likely to be true, not outlandish, not crazy. We'll talk a lot more about this when we get to burden of proof a little bit later in the semester, but you know, the weirder and more out there a conclusion is, the more likely it is to be false, the better the argument has to be for it. And some crazy conclusions will just be flat out stupid. You don't want to give the other person an argument for a stupid claim. And when it comes to premises, try to interpret them so A, they support the conclusion, and B, they are likely to be true. We'll also talk about the principle of charity when we get to filling in implied premises. That is a really complex thing that takes some practice, but it's important there. But the idea is we want to give the other person the best argument we can that is consistent with what they actually say. Um, Let me give you guys a couple examples of this. Again, these are just sort of, you know, toy arguments that are a little oversimplified. We're going to focus on that kind of argument, start the class out, just because, it's a little easier, right? So let me pull both of these up and we will talk about what the principle of charity might look like in each of these cases. All right. So argument one here. It is time for the Blue Book exam to die. For one thing, they are not effective educational tools. When students have high stakes exams, they cram for them, but studies have shown that they forget pretty much everything they learned through cramming. They are also awful from an accessibility standpoint, since students with accommodations must often take them in circumstances different from the rest of the class. This outs them as having accommodations, and it is also a huge hassle for them since they must take them in a different time and place. Finally, these exams massively stress students out. All right. So you guys will notice, like, look, it's time for the Blue Book exam to die. What is the conclusion of this argument? You might just say it's time for the Blue Book exam to die, but that's kind of loose metaphorical speech. Obviously this person doesn't want us to take a Blue Book out in a field and shoot it with a shotgun, right? Or burn it, right? What are they saying? They're saying something that professors should stop giving Blue Book exams, right? How do we phrase their conclusion? Suppose I attribute this conclusion to them. Professors should never give any sort of test. Well, that would be a bad thing to attribute to this argument, the person making it, for a couple reasons. One is they never say anything quite like that. We might like this person to be clear. What do you mean? Don't use this sort of metaphorical speech. Tell me what you want, right? But they never say never give any kind of test, right? They are talking about a specific kind of exam, the Blue Book exam. And, from what they say, they mean a certain type of test, like high stakes exams, right? And obviously, as a conclusion, this would be an almost impossible thing to argue for. This would be stupid, right? Professors should never give any sort of test. That's just that there's almost no way you could make that a plausible claim, right? Should they not give quizzes on reading to remind students? Should they not give take-home exams, right? Those would be a hard claim to substantiate, and the person never says that. Giving them a claim like that would be wildly uncharitable. They don't say it, and it is a crazy hard to prove claim. So if you want to give this person a conclusion, I think it would be something like, professors should not give high stakes tests like the traditional Blue Book exam. They don't quite say anything like this, but that's at least not a crazy claim. I can picture being, convinced of that. I can't picture being convinced of professors or teachers should never give any tests at all. We'll just say teachers since they don't necessarily mention professors, right? You know, that is a charitable, plausible thing for this person to say. Now we go in for our premises. So blue books are not effective educational tools. Now, one thing I want you guys to notice, not effective educational tools. Well, the person says this first. High stakes exam students cram for high stakes exams. Studies have shown everything. They forget pretty much everything they learn through cramming. Well, now, even though it's not in this order, this statement is supposed to, I think, support this claim that they're not effective educational tools. So it might be good to put that, to move things around a little bit and put that in front of it, right? Because it's supposed to show they're not effective educational tools. You know, we might split one up into two premises. I don't care. It doesn't matter too much. It might be when students have high stakes exams, they cram for them, split off. Studies have shown cramming not effective. It's not too important that we put in that order. You guys might be asking the question, well, how do we know what order to put the premises in? I would say when you first start distilling an argument, it doesn't matter too much, but as you think about things, you might want to reorder the premises. And when we talk about diagramming or mapping arguments next week, that'll give us a lot better idea of how we want to arrange our premises. And I'll just say, as you go through this, you might want to rethink this as you get an idea about what the structure of the argument is. You might want to move stuff around. It's just part of this whole exercise and how it helps us to see what's going on in an argument better. You know, awful from an accessibility standpoint, you know, might use less charged language. You might say, blue books. All right. Students with accommodations must take them in circumstances different from the rest of the class. I think we can just put that in there. If we want to use less charged language, which we should, we might just say that creates a privacy issue, right? Students with accommodations, I don't know, we might word it as is a hassle. And then six, I say, well, finally, these exams massively stress students out. Look, think about, if we're having premises, we want our premises to be true, right? Well, is it true that Blue Book exams stress every student out? If I said something like, all students are terrified of Blue Book exams, right? We want our premises to be true, and that's almost certainly not true. There are plenty of people some weird people who even just like high stakes tests. It's like, all right, I like this stress. I'm gonna go in there and get it done, right? So not all students are terrified of them. Would we say that all students are stressed out? No. Well, what would be a claim that is almost certainly true that fits with what the person says? Well, how about Blue Book exams cause many students anxiety? That fits with what the person says. It's true, and it would give us reason to accept this conclusion. So it is a charitable gloss on that premise in a way that all students are terrified or, you know, everybody feels anxiety wouldn't be. It does cause many students anxiety. That fits with what the person says. That's almost certainly true. That is a charitable paraphrase of what the argument's saying. And you might even say pretty much everything. Well, is that true? I think it might fit with what the person says. It might be charitable to say, forget much of what they learned through cramming. Again, a lot of these are going to be judgment calls, but I think this fits with what the person is saying in the argument. And it's almost certainly true. There's a lot of studies that show that people do forget a lot of this, and it does support the conclusion. That's a charitable read on this, right? Let's take another argument where we might want to invoke this principle of charity. It is the dogma of AA and other 12-step programs that addiction is a disease, just something like juvenile diabetes that an addict has no control over. Sorry, let me reword this. I should have been more careful writing this. That addict has more control over, let's just say that, right? Juvenile diabetes that an addict has no control over. I say not so fast. A lot of evidence shows that addicts can change their behavior when given strong enough incentives to do so. In studies where addicts are paid not to use their drug of choice, whereas, sorry, I should have worded this later, right? Let me revise this. Let's reread this. It is a dogma of AA and other 12-step programs that addiction is a disease, just something like juvenile diabetes that an addict has no control over. I say not so fast. A lot of evidence shows that addicts can change their behavior when given strong enough incentives to do so. In studies where addicts are paid not to use their drug of choice, most choose not to. Studies have also shown that alcoholics will cut their drinking when taxes on alcohol go up. Plus, most people with problem substance abuse actually stop on their own. All this shows that addicts are not passive zombies driven only by a desire for drugs. Well, what's the conclusion here, right? We have this first line with all this stuff. We have this second line with all this. Person is trying to say that this line that addiction is completely out of the control, that addicts have no control over whether they use their drug or not, that's not true. Well, how would we phrase that, right? What if I said, Addiction is a choice. Well, that's not really charitable, right? A, it's vague. What does it mean that it's a choice, right? B, the person never quite says that, right? They say something like, well, they have some control over. There's an element of choice here. They never say point blank, it's a choice. And look, it's almost depending on how we interpret this vague statement, it's almost certainly false, right? Look, there's all kinds of genetic markers for most addictions, right? If your uncles or your father or your mother was an alcoholic, you have a way higher risk of alcohol abuse. Same with other drugs. So this is just a crazy claim. It's almost certainly untrue, and the person doesn't quite say this. What if I said, well, this is even crazier, right? And it's just downright vile, right? It's like, well, again, there are in, we know that there are genetic factors for addiction. We know there are environmental factors. Plus, the person never says anything about blame. This is a conclusion that it would be incredibly hard to establish, and the person never says it, right? That would not be a charitable way to read this argument. More charitable might be something like, addiction is not exactly like a disease because addicts have some level of control over drug use. I think that fits with what the person says, or something like the claim that addiction is a disease that addicts have no control over is false. That would also fit, right? You're not attributing this wildly strong claim. It's consistent with this that, well, genetics plays a role, environment plays a role. You're just saying that isn't everything, right? That is a more plausible, more sensible, easier to argue for conclusion than these other ones. I think this would be a charitable conclusion to attribute to this person. And then the rest of this we can just slot this in. I don't think there's much with the principle of charity as far as the premises go. We might just say, um, a lot of evidence shows that addicts can change your behavior when given strong enough incentives to do so. We can just cut and paste that. I don't think we need to reword or paraphrase. But I think something you might notice is that these other um, claims probably support this. Studies have shown alcoholics cut their drinking when taxes go up. Two, in studies where addicts were paid not to use drugs, most chose not to. And so we might just say, we might just leave this word a lot because that's a subjective word. That might be number three here. One and two support it. We might even think that, you know, this one does too. The point is just that, when we give a premise to this conclusion to this person, we don't want to give them something absurd or vile, right? What they say is consistent with this much more moderate, much more sensible claim that I've given them. That's what we would probably want to do if we were distilling the argument to make sure we are being fair to the person, right? And this is especially important for written arguments because the person is not there to tell us if we're being unfair, right? if I said, well, it's what you're saying is that addiction is not like a disease because addicts have some control over drug use, and the person says no. What I'm saying is addiction is a choice. If you're having a conversation with a person and they say something like that, that might not be a very sensible thing to say, but if that's clearly what they're saying, it's what they're saying, right? But a lot of times in written communication where you don't have the person there to ask what they're saying, you have to try to be charitable so you can make sure you're being fair to them. Principle of charity, especially in this unit on informal argument, is going to be something I come back to a lot. It's really, really important, and it's not just a sort of mathematical rule, it's a sort of skill and habit that I think you have to get into. But I hope this gives you a better idea. Lavin talks a bit about the principle of charity, and I do think it's important. I hope this puts a little bit more flesh on the bones of the idea to talk about it this way. All right, and also just some more practice, what it looks like to distill an argument. All right, well, that's really all I want to cover for that. We will do a lot more practice with all of these ideas in next class. I hope you're just getting a better idea of how this stuff works.